Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Welcome, everybody, to another special edition episode of MSP 1337. That means it is the third Tuesday of the month, and we are doing the Fireside chat with Matt Lee of Pax8. Welcome to the show.
Man, as usual, it's great to be here. If you've hung on this long, it means you're at least a sadist to want to listen to these controls this deep. But I'm glad to be here adding Control 3 and all of its representative safeguards to it, because this is probably the most important one, right? This actually is.
This is the only one that matters. In fact, if you ask CIS to elaborate a little bit, they'd say we wouldn't have put this as Control 3. It would have been number 1. But then, in fact, what do you do with your assets to identify where data lives if you don't have that covered? So I think Controls 1 and 2 are almost implied.
Sure.
That you have to have that done. It's not saying that those are important in the context of data, other than to say,
but they are important in setting the context of where data could live.
That's right.
Right.
That's what I just said.
It's interesting. No, I wanted the point. You don't get the point.
Okay.
I get the point.
Yeah. So we also want to set the stage for, just because at this point we've talked about Controls 1 and then Control 2, and now we're on Control 3. Sure. That does not mean that we are planning to go linearly through all 18 controls. We have seen so much conflict, friction, heated discussions around specifically these 3 controls. In fact, I don't even know if we need to talk about Control 4, secure configurations. I think MSPs truly do understand what that means. How well they're executing it, well, we could split hairs on that and go all day, but just if you're hanging on this long, know that we're not as a goal saying we have to talk about each one, so that our audience knows what CIS controls are all about. This is about us helping solve for the discussions that happen at the bar, the discussions that happen in your internal organization.
Or start some, hopefully, right? Yeah.
So data protection is an interesting one, because it is if we were talking CIS alone or any framework, it's all about how we protect data.
In what ways? Right? This is so well defined. It's in every single courseware.
Right.
It's exactly the CIA triad, right?
Absolutely.
Which is data is the center of this, of what we're talking about. We're talking about data, juicy data. In fact, I just got off a call with Darren Mott. 4
triangles in a triangle, right? So top triangle, basically. Then then you have the inverted triangle that's in the middle to create the full. Yes.
Yeah, but it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right?
Or accessibility.
And so accessibility, if you'd prefer, I'm fine with it. But I was just saying, I just got off a call with Darren Mott, FBI agent that ran the counterintelligence program.
And funny, I have a call with him tomorrow.
He's an awesome dude. And so we were talking about this, and he said, listen, at the end of the day, threat actors and people on machines are after intelligence. Your data is intelligence. It might be intelligence about Matt Lee. It might be intelligence about my PII. It might be PHI. But at the end of the day, it's all intelligence, and data is all what it's about. So I bring that back to the subject of this is data protection is a very short safeguard, or it's a very short control in its overview. It's actually only 1 sentence, and there's not but 5 commas in it, right? So, and it says this, it says, develop processes and technical controls to identify, comma space classify, comma space securely handle, comma space retain, comma space and dispose of data. And the point is that you're actually now talking about the very subject, the lifeblood of every company, which is data, right? That might be a credit card and you're getting paid. That might be an invoice and you're asking to be paid. That might be your work product. But at the end of the day, this is about saying the real meat of any safeguard control family anywhere is the data is what we're trying to protect, correct? That's your thought on this.
I would add a word that's not called out in the overview, and that is privacy or privacy, depending on where you're from.
I'm going to use privacy today.
Privacy. It sounds a lot more like we are just super smart dudes when we say privacy. Like we know.
I sound very smart when I say privacy.
Very smart.
Yes,
very smart. Not all data needs to be kept private. We know that because of what lives out in public spaces. But at the same time, we've seen things like GDPR, CCPA, some of these
The
privacy
47
frameworks.
nascent privacy
Yeah.
legislations going on in every state.
Then you have things like the changes happening in NIST CSF 2.0. ISO just
Governance,
added
yeah.
like I think 3 or 4 that get into governance and privacy that were strangely absent from before. You don't see a lot of this in CIS where we focus largely on privacy.
Sure.
And I bring that up because classification of data and then that end one, which was dispose of data. Why would you ever need to dispose of data? Okay,
Oh,
well,
don't get me started.
there's lots of reasons, right? But
Yeah.
largely what you've seen with like GDPR and some of these others, the removal or disposal of data is almost at the forefront
It's
of
the
those
key tenant.
controls. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's where this becomes, I think, almost paramount as an MSP going through this control is to remember you said it, confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility or availability. We could split hairs on that one. But I think it's really important to recognize that data is not all created equal. And when we talk about the 3 classifications at the very high level,
Sure.
is it critical, sensitive, or public, is to remember part of the reason you go through this exercise is to make sure it still should be public. So that made me think of like CUI as an example. CUI data is in fact public data for the purposes of those that are bidding on this, right? Like this isn't general public, but it is made available to those that are going to bid on this project, right? Like they didn't sign some contract to bid. They would have to bid and then sign a contract, right? It's implied that they're not going to do bad things with this data, but it is confidential, unclassified, right? Is that safe?
It's controlled unclassified
Sorry,
information.
controlled.
Yeah. So, and I would argue that it probably has received some degree of me actually being in the DIB, signing information to say that I will keep this data private. And so I'd probably split hairs with you on that one. But I think the point you're trying to make is still valid of saying that, there's data that is public that should be public. There's data that isn't public. There's even definitions of private of saying maybe this is only for my org or for the bidders of this CUI or from right to that space.
Yes,
but
thanks for helping me clarify because that's really
that's
what
I do, brother.
Yes,
that's what I'm
thank
here
you.
for.
Yes. So at the end of the day, and we can, I think this is what we really need to emphasize more than anything else, is that whether it's this control set or another framework, this should be the fundamental component in
100%.
whatever you're doing. So
Yeah.
when you are implementing a new RMM tool, when you're leaving a vendor and going to a new vendor, or you're adding a vendor into the equation, this should be how you are operating before you look at any of the other safeguards and controls. And that's why it's number 3.
Yeah. And when you think about it, it really is part of I like to say that the first 3 or the opening salvo of CIS is know thyself. Right. And I think you can't do 3 well because 3 is asking you to know the data, start classifying the data, start saying how I want to treat this data. Am I going to dispose of it? Am I supposed to keep it for any regulatory reason? Those type of things come into conversation around that.
You have
right?
to start with where.
But you have to start with where. You have to start with the 2 wheres. One of those is an asset that's called a hardware and physical asset. One of those is another asset called a software asset, right? And this last piece is only to determine where your data flows are, where data exists, what sensitivity is it. And ultimately, to your point on GDPR, if I call in and say, I need my data deleted, and you think you've deleted it 5 places and the 6th one you missed, I still have a claim that you did not honor my request. And so now it becomes very imperative from a privacy, if you want to sound smart, perspective,
we're working on that.
Indubitably. But the point is if you start down that path, the data needs to be classified. So let's break this down. TLDR, at the end of the day, what is this? I can tell the health of your organization around security, understanding by just asking, what are your sensitivity definitions? What do you follow? Is it public, private, my org? Like at Pax8, we only have 3. It's public, private, and private org, like org being my sales org or org being my management org, right? Those type of things. And so, you get into this point where what are we trying to do as we unpack this now is apply appropriate protections beyond what those classifications are. And so the argument would be public. Why would you spend a lot of money protecting public?
Right.
If it's public, if it's on your website, if it is a document you share with vendors, if it is and you made that point.
Comes back to, I think you do need to spend some time on this because today it's public doesn't mean it always is.
True.
And this gets into like when I share documents out of SharePoint or otherwise, you should always put a limit a timeline on an expiration on that data accessibility.
Yep.
Because it could change. Legal could come down and say, hey, that branding, that's now no longer available through public means. You have to be gated, whatever.
Sure.
So obviously we could continue to go down this path. Let's talk about for a minute. This is a relatively large control as far as the number of safeguards in here. I think there's 13 or 14. But what's interesting is almost half of them are implementation group 1.
They are. It's massive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not giving you a lot of room for like when you mature your organization.
Yeah. No. You need to know your data now.
Yes.
And even so much as to, 3.6 being encrypt data on end devices containing sensitive data, right? And now you're getting into BitLocker enforcement. But even further than that, when you're starting to talk about like maybe even using systems like AIP to actually encrypt the data, so once it's stolen because it was labeled sensitive, it isn't readable, or right, those kind of things that get into play. So
you can't reverse hash it. What?
What? But your point is, I think you hit really well of like there are 6 safeguards in IG1, and I haven't done the direct math, but I don't know that I can think of another safeguard set or control that has that many IG1 safeguards in it.
Let's talk through them a little bit, because I think it's important to hear some of them. Like you talked about sensitive for 3.6, and what's interesting about that one is that's a project that you just don't do in 2 seconds, right? You're not going to just encrypt all endpoints and go, yep, done. You might.
Sure. You could if you were using all Intune or something to that effect, or
and I'd be curious how that plays out from a repercussion standpoint. When you reboot your machine, you can't figure out why you can't log in.
Yeah. Well, and that's where you see systems making that easier. I don't want this to turn into a giant Microsoft pitch, but the conversation is, if I started a company tomorrow, would I buy a server? Would I do? I probably wouldn't. I likely would be, especially in the SMB, a identity consumer, right? That would be either Azure AD or Okta or something like that. And then I would buy and use SaaS software for the most part, and I would single sign on into it. When you think about that model, Microsoft kind of has the front end of this where I can encrypt those devices, store those keys for recovery already in the administrative console. In fact, I can give it to you on your phone as a recovery model. And so you get into this where the repercussion aspect drops significantly over time, especially over the last 5 years. But to your point, there was a time where you go to do that, and it is a monstrous challenge. And still for a lot of people today, it might be. But yeah, so it's a good.
Let's go through. Let's start back at 1, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on these, because I think what's really interesting about this control that is unique in some respects across the entire CIS stack is the way in which it emphasizes having a program, inventory, and then it gets into tracking access control. And it's like, you haven't even gotten the access.
We haven't even talked about control 6. We haven't even gotten to that, but they're saying before you ever do that, figure out the persona, right? Like you hit this really well, right? Like, and
in web development, personas are actually something that most organizations spend time on. And I remember in college taking a database schema class, and the project I got assigned was, this is way before we had EMR systems like we do from a maturation today. And it was, doctor role, nurse role, secretary role, and like what data tables do they have access to? And I remember not doing well.
It almost sounds like role-based access control, one might say. Yeah.
Right. And what was interesting though about this is we're being asked to define this before we have visualized what the program is going to even look like.
Yeah, which is actually good in a way, in the sense that you get to understand this principle of least privilege before you ever get to it. And we're not going to tackle that today. That is
because what does it look like when it's done? Like, and this is a perfect example of function over form. And I think as MSPs, as you look at the shiny objects that are going to be tied to product software and things that you put in your environment and things that your clients want to see, that is form over function. And largely our development cycles in the software space are like how to make something pretty that everybody wants to use, regardless of how good it is at what it does. If it looks good, it must be good, right? When was the last time you looked at a website and you said, I can't use this because it looks ugly? If it's an ugly website, you've already moved on, right? Like if
probably.
If it looks like it was written in DOS, those kind of things, you're not using it, right? And unfortunately, that's where I think this becomes somewhat problematic. So as you're going through your process, which is getting into like having that program in place, then getting into your inventory, and then having those access control lists, is like, this is not about pretty.
Yeah.
This is about knowing what should or shouldn't be in place. This is really, at the end of the day, understand your organization structure. If I'm an
And
engineer. Am I HR?
well, and this is why this is also probably the least executed control that I see in the world, right? In the
Or at
sense
least
that,
executed well?
yeah, well, I would even go so far as to say absolutely ignored. And here's what
Okay.
I would pose as a question for an MSP, especially when you start talking about the MSP serving the client. Okay, what systems does your client use? Well, I know all the stuff that people have made tickets about. I've got everything I've documented in IT Glue. Where's their sensitive stuff? What do they classify that information system as? How do you respond to that information system from the protection perspective based on those iterations? Never been asked. I almost guarantee you never been asked. They don't get into that question. And so my point is, if you start looking at the 3.1, it says establish and maintain a process. Establish and maintain a process. In this process, address data sensitivity, who owns it, handling of that data, retention limits, disposal requirements, based on sensitivity and retention standards for the enterprise. And the enterprise obviously meaning just company in our use of this, right? And review and update documentation annually when significant changes occur. My point is like, just if you look at 3.1, before you even get to access control, which would then be requisite upon that need to know and that kind of principle of least privilege that you see playing out. 3.1, nobody's doing it. And I think if you then took that same question and asked you about your MSP, how do you define your data structure? And what do you define as your labels? Answer, gotcha. And then what is it? Who owns that data system? Who makes decisions on its sensitivity? What's your change control process on it? Not ever going to exist today in most MSPs, Chris. And you get to see the tip of that spear, but and you see them and you know the ones that exist that are doing it. But my point is, when you think about doing that, that's literally just a simple exercise. You could classify entire information systems and SaaS applications as a certain sensitivity, right? You could say,
Sure.
hey, that's my EMR. It is all going to be PHI. I'm going to tag the whole damn thing with PHI, right? Like you would agree with that.
Which is sometimes often over exaggerated, right? So like for example, I have a server and there are 4 file shares on that server, and we're going to argue that all 4 of those file shares could contain PHI.
Sure.
But we said specifically that share F drive is where all ePHI is supposed to live.
Yes.
That is us narrowing scope and not saying, hey, the server is PHI, therefore we have to do these things. I have seen some danger in that where they overextend on where PHI lives and then are now putting themselves at risk, like things like C:/, yep, contains PHI. And you're like,
sure.
Why are you allowing people to store data at the root of the C drive? Like this is on
but
a
in
lot
the
of reasons
same breath,
stupid.
It sometimes makes it easier to apply systemic functions to systemic objects,
True.
right? And I think there's an argument for that. And I
The
think
point is to have the
it'll
exercise,
depend.
to have the exercise, and to not just say, well, yeah, we're a doctor's office, so everything is PHI. Well, that's not using.
Then that is agreed. That is now just over
and it's dangerous.
And it's dangerous, yeah. But if you're thinking about this, my point would be start simple with 3 and don't get massively in the weeds. In fact, this was the one specifically called out by Phyllis saying, why did we make IG1s, IG2, IG3s? Because we found everybody getting stuck in 3 way deeper before they'd ever talked about 5 or before they'd ever talked about 6, before they'd ever talked about SSO, before they'd ever talked, right? And so you see that aspect of it being, we needed to make this at least broken into chunks. And so if you follow through on what's in IG1, you have make a data management process. You follow that quickly with having a data inventory, which goes kind of hand in hand, right? Because now you're saying have a data inventory of where those ISs live, where those information systems and or SaaS applications or drives or shares live, right? Is essentially the concept.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that the overview of this control actually calls out all of IG1.
Yeah,
right?
Pretty much. Like each comma is one of the 6. Yeah, exactly.
Identify, classify, protect, right?
And destroy, which will be in this. Yeah,
right. Because you could get, if you were to just look at this from an identification standpoint, you can move on from IG1, and it gets a little bit interesting. Like establish and maintain a data classification scheme. Ooh, man, that's a mouthful, and you could really go down a rabbit hole with like I thought we just said like sensitive, critical,
but they do try to make it easy. So if you look at 3.7, which is the first IG2 control you're talking about, they do say enterprises may use labels such as sensitive, confidential, and public and classify their data according to those labels. And I think this is actually a clarifying safeguard in my mind that makes it, to your point, You dig in first and start understanding, I need to list all my data, list all the things that might be sensitive or not. And you may deem a lot of things not sensitive or public, or maybe it's, not confidential, but business function. You get into a lot of those, but then they break it down and say, okay, let's just set the stage here. Have at least 3 or 4 categories that then now you can apply certain systemic functions to those categories, right? Even though they might touch different data systems, different capabilities in those data systems, even as you get into that, extensibility. But I do want to touch on the rest of these.
This also gets
ID1s
into change, right? This is why it can change. This is why it's important that the program establishes that you're reviewing data periodically to make sure that it didn't move from one state to another in your classification scheme.
And data systems. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we didn't store some data in our marketing platform, but all of a sudden now we are bringing in dates of birth, or all of a sudden we are bringing in information that's more public, PII. Now we might have a delineation in that system, and it may need to be reassessed. So also in this control 3.1 and 3.2, 3.1 just says have a process, but also doesn't encapsulate the inventory in that process. And if you look back at like 2.1 and 1.1, they actually do. So it's almost like in 3, they're like, whoa, bro, you've got to not only have a process, but that thing must make an inventory, right? Because they actually segmented those two, which is weird, because in 2.1 and 1.1, the inventory is part of the process in its own definition in 1.1 and 2.1. But that's not the case in 3.1. It splits it out to 3.2, because remember, in 2.2, you're immediately addressing, and in 1.2, you're starting to address. Here, we're not. We're saying, nope, boys and girls, slow down. We're continuing to build up the data now. And so you get into 3.3 and it says now have ACLs based on a user's need to know. Now, if you unpack that, you are talking POLP. POLP is principle of least privilege. And if you want my, ELI 5, it's blast radius reduction. Well, when you think about that in military, it's the grenade. Now somebody jumps on it. All friends don't die. Dude's eviscerated. All friends still live. When you think about this, I used to have this concept before these zero trust principles were highly adopted, and I called it live compromised. And it was just this understanding of saying, always assume breach. I mean, that's basically what's one of the pillars of zero trust is, right? And it's saying, well, if I do that, then if Chris Johnson doesn't need access to companies in Wichita that we're supporting, why the hell would I give Chris Johnson access to that? I would actually limit him down to Team Bravo in Dallas, and that's what he has access to, right?
So you should, let's clarify that a little bit, because this is where a lot of MSPs do the opposite, because, well, what if I need Chris to do something and he doesn't have access? He won't be able
when
to.
That need changes, we will give him that access, and in a JIT-GIA fashion, or just in time, enough access.
And you see this a lot with vendor access to client tenant, right? So like when I was at the school district, I had user accounts that had admin privileges that were for our vendors, and I would regularly have vendors get mad because I was trying to update the HVAC control system last night and I couldn't get in. It's like, you haven't logged into the system in more than 90 days. Your account expired.
Yep. And when you get into that, that is a control in 5 that says disable dormant accounts or ones that have not been used in 45 days or longer. We will get to that Johnny foreshadowing here when we tackle more of 5 and 6, right, at some point.
Yeah. So let's so I don't
they go
think
hand in hand.
We are like, we've made it all the way through, IG1 in a 30-minute window, and we have 5 minutes left. So what's interesting about this control where it moves into IG2 and IG3 is you get into things like, we talked about the classification scheme. We kind of glazed over that a little bit. I think people kind of get that. This is just a
data flows come into play. Like, where does the data live? Not just where it sits at the end, but as it transits through, right? Like, now you're starting to get into like the flow of the data.
Yeah, the flow of the data. And this is why it's interesting that you have this before you get to 3.9 and 3.10, which is, and 3.11, which is encrypt data on removable media. And this one's said differently. It says you should just encrypt it because it's on portable media, regardless of what classification it is. Because it's saying you're putting yourself at risk if you can't definitively say what is on that drive or that portable media. So follow that one to the the letter of saying it's saying encrypt, period. Then you get into 3.10, which is encrypt sensitive data in transit and encrypt sensitive data at rest. Not all data. It doesn't say that. And this is one where I see complexities get overdone. And healthcare is a good example of this. Oh yeah, we encrypt all the servers. No, you don't. Your EMR system would grind to a halt if the databases were encrypted prior to you trying to use the database for your EMR system. Woohoo, right? Like,
but now you see so this is where it actually builds on itself. So if you look at 3.6, it says encrypt data on end user devices, where you've now seen an AES offload chip on most physical hardware. You have the ability to run, as needed on demand file system encryption at a full totality. And I think to that point, you're saying encrypt them, period. It's almost like the flash drive, encrypt user devices. Doesn't matter what's on them, encrypt them. To your point on the server side of it, and you're talking about now at transit, right, is now saying make sure you're not just doing an HTTP site that's easily siphoned, right? Make sure you're touching
similarly to email, right? Don't just rely on TLS to be like, in theory, we're going to try secure encrypted transit first, and if it doesn't go through, well, I'll have no way of knowing.
We'll
that
fail
it
back.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead. We'll be nice to each other now.
We have three safeguards because we've been just kind of talking through them. And the remaining three are segment, data processing, and storage based on sensitivity. This is a hard one to do, in my opinion.
It is. Yeah. It's an enclave conversation, right? When you start thinking about this, what you're really saying is, now I want to see an information system itself have a separate secured methodology of access and processing and usability, and the accessibility itself must now be in a segmented and separate data processing methodology. I think of things like CUI and
I remember an example of this that was kind of pre me really digging into frameworks, and it was the idea that if I was connected to the corporate network on my laptop wirelessly and I'm in the lobby, my access is changing based on my physical proximity to the safety net of walls and doors, right?
The walled garden model, right?
I can get to the internet. I can't get to the F drive that has sensitive data on it. I can't get to the intranet. I can't get to, but when I go back through the door into my office, even though I haven't switched networks, I now have geolocation based access that's changed. And that was something we did kind of early on that was really cool. We all thought it was a big deal.
Sure.
Now everything lives somewhere else. So like having access to the internet is access to everything, right? And so I think this one's kind of important because we don't often spend enough time on things like, nope, sorry, you can't get to those directories from Panama Canal or the Philippines or you're using data. Some of the data location stuff is less about where it lives and more about how or where you're accessing from.
Well, and that's what you're getting at, right? They say processing in here. I feel like it might be a little stretch on the safeguard in my mind of kind of that intention of where my geolocation is. I think when you think about this segment data processing based on sensitivity, it's like, think about having an HL7 interface that's going to go out to something else. That's a processing. It should live in the same set of controls where that data sensitivity originates, which would be the EMR or the end modality that's collecting it, those things. And so I feel like when you're starting to talk about that, you're more akin to talking about something easier for people to understand.
Well,
and
so let's clarify what HL7. Let's clarify HL7
sure.
as you brought it up. So HL7 being a data format that literally lives in plain text, right? Like it is not an encrypted model. It is hey,
and
look,
it's medical
data. It is medical data, and it is it's essentially it's a format for allowing two disparate data systems to talk to each other, share data back and forth. And obviously there's ways to secure that. That's not the HL7 by its very nature is not secure, and that's fine because you can secure it.
That's why I used it as an example.
Yeah, it's a great example. I really do like it. And it's unfortunate that today we're not seeing standardization across the board, because I think that would allow for data could move back and forth very anonymized and then get put back together with a master database.
Hand shook with certs and things that are
and
great.
Like the pieces come back together.
But 312, without beating it to death, I think is easier to understand when you start thinking about SAWs. And SAWs are secure administration workstations.
Yeah.
They'll come into play in 5 and in 6. But as you talk about having a SAW, you're saying, I am now an admin. I won't even do admin-y things on non-admin-y machines, right? And so you're now actually fully segmenting that function. Now, think about that in the relevance of processing. I like to take and not beat this control to death, but it's really saying, if you defined an information system as more secure and needing more stringent security protocols, safeguards, and things like that, and controls, then you can't then process data that's just as secure on systems that aren't as hardened, right? That's kind of the flow. And you can't know that unless you already have a data map and understand where the data flow is, right? Because you wouldn't know about that HL7 interface unless you knew it needed to leave your EMR, go to your radiologist or some other practitioner, and therefore I have a flow. And so you have to know that flow. And that's kind of all the whole back to CUI, right? When you talk about CUI, some of the challenges with CUI that I've heard the brilliant practitioners, the Jacob Horns, the, those players out there, and Joy Belinda Beal. I don't want to like skip anybody either. You know what I mean?
Right,
But
right.
calling out those
And
two. 'Cause I
all of
love
my
them.
friends.
And all's my friends.
Yeah.
When you think about that, a lot of people say, here's where I define CUI to be. But when you go in and look at it and assess it, no, it passes through Sally's hand when it comes on the fax machine.
Yeah.
Then she scans it in and it stores in a folder that goes onto the S drive. And then they eventually move. Like, you need to know those data flows so you can say, here's the scope of my information system containing CUI, right? Like, that's the bane of that existence. But we beat this point to death, unless you got any other points on it.
A little bit. But I think it's important to note that organizations tackling this, because not all MSPs have like, oh, and I just have a budget for another machine sitting over here. Call it your jump box, call it whatever you want. But the reality is, if you're an MSP that's kind of in that size, you still have to go through something to get to where data does live. And you can do a lot of things without a heavy lift that addresses this through a compensating control. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical machine, right? So
yeah, like I added at some point, I already had virtualization infrastructure at clients, and I would add in a virtual jump box that I paid the license for and ran as my place to keep my segmented admin over from my assets that are here. And I know that's kind of a little bit of a tangential use of this, but let's get through these last two. So we
have two left. So
yeah.
I think just to be clear, there are quite a few of these that MSPs can do without spending more money, without them being complicated. But the reason I think they're in IG2 isn't because of the complexity of the safeguard. It's because you should not be tackling those if you haven't done IG1.
And most of that will include setting up an account development structure in 5 and in 6 when you're setting up access control lists and enforcement of access and revocation of access. And you can't build on these better things.
You're like a train that's left the station. Like, you're picking up speed so fast. Pretty soon you're like, wow, they have 37 safeguards in data control 3. This is weird. So 3.13 is deploy a data loss prevention solution, DLP. This is common language, especially for those using 365 or Google.
Everybody
it's been around forever, right? Networks and other products that have DLP functionality.
What are you trying to prevent loss of? Is that just going to be what you find in social security numbers or account numbers, or is it going to be more meaningful data?
Well, so let's clarify that, because we're talking about two things. I think when we talk about DLP, there's the obvious ones of like, I'm going to move a file and save it in OneDrive, or I'm going to send a file via email. There's DLP there of looking for information that follows a pattern. Then there's also, maybe there's even 3. Then there's the one that says, as an organization, we have a policy that says, if content is deemed sensitive, hit the button and encrypt it. We're telling you to do this, right?
And now DLP touches on that sensitivity being sent out and things around that definition, right?
And I think when you go the route of encrypt all data via email and those types of things, I think you run into lots of walls, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole today.
I agree.
But back to the DLP part, it's also like you're trying to prevent things from happening that could be detrimental to your organization. So not just where the data went. So if I take all of the files in F drive and I copy and save to local, that should be a flag, or even prevented from happening.
Well, guess what? You just defined 3.14, didn't you? Which is log sensitive data access. And as you think about this, what's interesting, this came into my discussion with Darren Mott. This came into the Dragos breach a little while back, right? Where Dragos had, I say incident. I wouldn't call it a breach necessarily, but they had
I don't think you should ever use the B word unless you're a damn attorney.
I've heard a guy say that before. I don't know who that was. I don't know. It's like Matt Lee or something. No, you're accurate. But in this case, this was the public release of information about this compromisation for Dragos. And the way they found the threat actor was they were accessing and asking for access to folders that job role should not have been asking for. And in Darren Mott's example, he's saying, hey, put a juicy folder on the R drive that says Chris Johnson's personal money records and see who clicks on it. And if somebody's clicking on it, it's probably not a good thing. It's probably malicious. And so expanding even that definition of logging sensitive data access, sometimes you might be a honeypot that you're logging. Very sensitive data that's fake sensitive, right? That you've created. He even went into like taking a document and recreating it as fake to put out there, but it looks real, right? For a threat actor, things like
So
that.
it's funny
really
you keep bringing up Darren. So I actually was on a PC-Matic
there's the common connection.
internal an
Yeah.
internal thing with PC-Matic on, and Darren Mott was on, and it was the two of us discussing some of the stuff we're talking about now. And Darren and I are doing everything we can to avoid plugging what their product actually does. And you got
right,
Corey
like
just
working
bouncing
hard
up and
not
down.
to, right?
Yeah.
He's like,
He's
dang
like,
it, you
say
son of a
it,
gun.
say
I
it,
want
say
you
it.
to say
Yeah.
it, say it.
Yeah.
Say it's on whitelisting of applications. I dare you.
Yeah.
I
So
digress.
since we brought him up, like if you haven't, he does the Cyber Guy podcast. And
He's so good.
It's kind of a play on words. Cyber is spelled CYBUR,
BUR.
like
Yeah.
the Bureau of Investigation.
Yes.
So check him out. He's got some great episodes on there. To clarify, we did get through all of the safeguards today. I think that the one takeaway that I have, I don't know about you, Matt, is data protection should be something that we are thinking about all the time, whether we're using a control set or a framework or whatever. It's that when we buy products and services, when we implement products and services, when we onboard new humans into our organization, we must consider the ramifications around data and how that ecosystem works, and apply the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and applicability. And quite honestly, if you're going through this safeguards and you are compromising one of those three in implementation of the safeguard, either you are implementing the safeguard wrong, or you need to revisit and figure out, like, does the data meet the criteria for why I'm implementing the safeguard?
Yeah. And I think, to paint that picture also of my takeaway, which, by the way, it's applicability is what you said, but you probably meant accessibility. I'm just going to correct you before the audience does.
Yeah, applicability is totally unrelated to accessibility and availability.
I figured it might be. Those others were synonymic, if you will. But, I think my takeaway
was just looking for
this.
an A word. I can come up with some others if we're not careful here.
It's fair, and I probably deserve it. My key takeaway is this is the first vignette of know yourself, know your assets, know your data, know what it's worth, classify its sensitivity, that is so fundamental because everything else builds on this, right? When you start talking about, okay, I want to log sensitive access. Well, what's sensitive? If I'm talking to an MSP, an RMM's pretty damn sensitive. A PSA could be pretty dang sensitive. You start getting into IT glue, it's very sensitive. You start getting into passwords, it's extremely sensitive. And you can see that you would build escalatory controls.
True.
The more sensitive it is, and therefore knowing how to catalog and segment, even if you're wrong in how you catalog and segment, gives you the ability to tell a very reasonable story of escalating controls based on the risk and not spending money frivolously on things that don't need that risk being protected, if that makes sense, right? You're really setting that
before we put this
stage
to bed, I have a question that you made me think of, is when we talk about the data classification and we talk about sensitive data, MSPs have a lot of client data, and we've been
or at least access there too, right? At least definite access there too, for sure.
Okay, so let me rephrase this. The data that we store in our RMM tools and the data that we store in our PSA and the communication that's stored via Slack, chat, Teams, I don't care, contains in many cases, almost all cases, what I would classify as sensitive data, whether the client says it's sensitive or not. It's
sensitive in our fiduciary responsibility, that's for sure, right?
So I wanted to make that the delineation here, because I think that it's easy to focus up. We first have to face this internally and do it for ourselves.
Yeah.
But as MSPs, we kind of fall in a different category than a traditional SMB, because there is data that is fundamentally being stored in our environments that's not our data.
Yes. Yeah, and may have more lackadaisical processes, procedures, and understanding of their own inherent risk than we do while we store it, right? And I think that's the other interesting part about it.
Well said. So at this point, most MSPs listening to this are like, and I'm not going to be an MSP anymore because this seems like a terrible idea. No, the point is like to just remember,
treat it that way.
Yeah, just as you're going through this, client data as an MSP is any data that you're responsible for that you don't own. And I think we have to be careful with that, because we sometimes forget that, no, that's our PSA. It's like, okay, well, that may be true, but what's in it that's also yours?
Yes.
or not
Yeah.
yours, that you still
Yeah,
have
that
to-
you don't have control filters in place to say, no, Sally, I have the ability to delete any type of PII that might accidentally be in this, or PHI you might have accidentally included in this screenshot, or nope, not in
Yeah,
place.
watch
Can't
me
do
purge
it.
my clients that I no longer have out of my PSA. See how successful I am at that.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're going to anonymize the records, delete them. But like, yeah, it's a lot of work. So I think the argument you're making is extremely poignant and a good one to make to MSPs. But this one, I got to be honest with you, I could probably spend my whole life thinking about how to be better at data classification and never leave that safeguard and that set of safeguards, right?
And
Like
that's why
I
it's
could spend my
important to
whole
keep the
time.
3. Keep it to the 3, right?
Yep.
So if it seems like it's sensitive, maybe it's just call it that. So I actually
Yep.
worked with an MSP, and I'll wrap this up. I worked with an MSP that when I sat down with them to go over this control specifically, they had already gotten to 16 classifications of data, and I'm like,
Oh my gosh.
oh my word, like
Perfect.
oh
The enemy of
that's
good.
yeah,
Right.
like
Yeah.
and so when I looked at that, and they had built out this great folder structure and like the different shares on the network, and I finally just said, how do you keep track of, like, where's the legend? Like, do you have it on a whiteboard in the office, like, so that everybody can go, oh,
Yeah.
that's green, that can go here. That's blue. Oh, where's blue go? Where does blue go? And then you're
Yeah,
traveling, and you're like, I don't remember what
was that
what
blue or
category
green?
7 was.
Stop
Yeah.
reading my stupid calendar. I have like 26 different categories for my calendar, but yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
that's an interesting conversation to have in another date and time with OCD
Maybe.
Matt Lee. We'll
Yeah,
do
yeah,
that
for
on.
sure.
Well, are they in pastel? Are they pastels or are
They are
they
pastels. I'm a
well,
fan
there
of
you go. Well,
pastels. I
and
like
did our voices
the
just change? Talk.
yeah,
Okay.
we got the Easter kind of
All
sound,
right.
you know.
I am going to,
See you,
for those of you
brother.
listening, this has been Fireside Chat with Chris and Matt Lee. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
See y'all.